Welcome to our first video. It's going to be about metric base units and prefixes. So earlier this week we've been talking about what the metric system is and then why it's important. So now we're really going to start to learn the nitty-gritty details about it. By now in class we should have updated our unit organizer and found this particular page in our binder. If you haven't yet, at this point you would pause the video, find this page in your binder, and then hit play again. Metric base units and prefixes are really important, and they're actually really easy once you get the hang of it. First, what we're going to do is we're going to put a 3 in the upper right hand corner, because this is the third page on our unit organizer. Now we're going to get started on content. The first thing we're going to talk about is length, and length is the amount of distance between 2 points. So typically here at home in America, we use the English system. So we'll use things like inches, feet, yards, and miles. But in the metric system, there's something called a base unit that we're going to build off of, and that's the meter. And we would abbreviate that with the letter M. Now there are some fun conversion factors we're going to have to know for our future studies of the metric system and when we start studying about motion. The first is that 1 meter is equal to 39 inches. The second is that 1 kilometer, which is 1,000 meters, is equal to 0.62 miles. So if you ever hear someone running a 5K or 5 kilometers, you would take that 5 and multiply it by 0.62, and you would figure out that they've actually run 3.1 miles. And the last conversion factor is kind of a blast from the past. It's 2.54 centimeters is equal to 1 inch. The second thing we're going to talk about today is mass. And mass is the amount of matter in an object. Now a lot of Americans will confuse mass with weight. They use them interchangeably. That's actually not the case, but we're going to go into that much later. So at home in America, we'll use things like pounds and ounces. But in the metric system, what we're going to build off of is the gram. That's abbreviated with the letter G, lowercase g. The only conversion factor we're going to need to know for mass is 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. So for those of you that read the expensive rice story in the metric mix-up, the reason that was charged so much is because if you charge per kilogram, that's half of charging per pound. The third thing we're going to talk about is volume. Volume is the amount of space an object takes up. So the typical English units would be things like gallons, ounces, pints, and quarts. Anything like with liquid measurements in baking or cooking, those are all units of volume. But the metric base unit is the liter. A lot of you are already familiar with the liter because of the bottles of pop you find in the grocery store. Those are 2-liter bottles, and that's just a lot of pop. The conversion factors we're going to need to know here is that 1 liter is equal to 33.8 ounces, and that 3.76 liters is equal to 1 gallon. So 3.76 liters is about equivalent to 5 Camelback, those water bottles that are about 750 milliliters per piece. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the metric system base units is temperature. And temperature is a measure of the warmth or coolness of an object. Now when you listen to the weather report, for example, this week it was really hot, so one of the highs, I think it was yesterday, it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So our typical English unit is degrees Fahrenheit. In the metric system they use degrees Celsius. So there's 2 things we're going to learn. So to go from Celsius to Fahrenheit, our conversion factor would be, we would take our degrees Celsius, multiply it by 2, and then add 32. To go from Fahrenheit to Celsius, we would take our degrees Fahrenheit, subtract 32, and then divide that number by 2. That gives you a rough estimate. It's not exact, but it's what we're going to use for this year. Now the metric system uses prefixes in order to have different units. So the 3 questions we're going to learn how to answer is how can you remember the metric prefixes, what are the names of the 6 common prefixes, and what is the value of each of those prefixes. Let's answer this one first. K stands for kilo, K-I-L-O. H stands for hecto. D stands for deca, and the abbreviation for that, remember, is D-A. B is our base unit. Little d here stands for deci, and that's going to be abbreviated as just a lowercase d. C stands for centi, and M stands for milli. When we look at our base units, we can go back to the top of the page and go, okay, so we have meter, gram, and liter. Those are our 3 base units that we're going to use prefixes with. So meter, gram, and liter. And when we talk about our base units, that has a value of 1. If we go this way, the numbers get bigger. But if we go to the right, they get smaller. And I've mentioned before that the metric system is based on the powers of 10. So if we're getting bigger, we would technically move the decimal point that exists right here over to the right. So deca stands for 10, because there's 10 years in a decade. Hecto stands for 100, and kilo stands for 1,000. If we're going this way, the numbers are going to get smaller by a value of 10, so we're going to move the decimal point over this way. So deci is kind of like our first decimal, so 0.1. Centi is 0.01. So you know how we call a penny a cent? Well, a penny is 1/100th of a dollar, so that's why we call them cents. And milli is 1/1000th, so 1 over 1,000. So we've gone through what are the names and what are the values. Now let's think of a clever way to remember the order of the metric prefixes. And I really like to tell a story to go along with this. How we're going to remember is by this saying, King Henry died by drinking chocolate milk. So once upon a time, there was a really mean king of England named King Henry. You might have heard of him. He beheaded a lot of his wives. Well, it turns out he also had a huge milk allergy. And one day the people were so tired of him killing all of his wives that someone slipped him a glass of chocolate milk and said that nothing would happen. Well, he drank it, and he ended up dying. So whenever you think of the metric prefixes, think of that story so you know that the order goes like this. After you would take notes, sometimes you're going to have to answer some questions on a Google Doc. But today we're going to move right to the independent practice, which is going to be the first item in our grade book.